All right, so this is our final review session, and we're going to be covering cognitive psych and personality intelligence and abnormal psych and treatment. So we have a lower number of people here today, so that's totally fine. And so we've only got 5 people who have voted, but we will take those 5 votes and start with the ones that people vote the most. So there's really only actually one that has 5 votes. And then a bunch that have 4. And so we'll go through that and we'll go kind of less and less until maybe we get through all the ones or until time runs out. So hopefully that sounds good for you guys and we'll get going. All right. So the one that got all 5 votes for you guys is the very first one, the information processing model. So the information processing model is really simple. It's just that model that shows how all the different parts of memory are linked. So you've got let me see if I can find a real quick picture of it. Uh, so you've got sensory memory, and then uh, that can hold 3 to 7 things, uh, and then uh, and it can last for about 3 seconds, and then it's forgotten. It's really just the thing that kind of shows how all the different stages of memory are linked. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to download to save the image. Okay. So I'm going to present it just so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Otherwise, it gets a little confusing. Where is that? Sorry, hold on, you guys. Oh, that's why I can't find it. Sorry, give me one more second. I am not doing so well with this right now. Apparently, when you present it, you can only present it from something on the web. So I had the image saved, but there we go. Sorry about this, you guys, but I promise it'll make sense. All right. So this is the information processing model, which basically shows how all the memory is linked. So you've got sensory memory, you've got working memory, you've got long-term memory. Working memory can also be substituted with short-term memory there. But you can see how that if you don't retain that knowledge after sensory memory, if you don't pay attention, then it's forgotten. With short-term memory, if you can hold it for about 15 seconds without rehearsal, but eventually with rehearsal, you're going to encode it into the long-term memory. This is the rehearsal here, which keeps it in your short term and then can eventually move it into your long term. And then from the long term memory, we use our working memory where we retrieve and access information and then use it in the present moment. But again, after about 15 seconds, without any sort of rehearsal or practice, we're going to forget it. All right. Is there any questions about that? And you probably have that in your notes anyway. I just wanted to show it to you guys right here. Okay. So the next one is the units of thought. And the units of thought there are 5 distinct units of thought, and then we're also going to do types of thought after that. They kind of go together anyway. So the units of thought are basically when we are looking at the idea of thought, of cognition, how can we break it down into smaller, into the most basic idea to the most complex? Well, we start with the most basic one, and the most basic one is an image, right? I say, think about an elephant. And what appears? An elephant in your head, in that kind of like, in our mind's eye, we see that elephant. So an image is the most basic unit of thought. After that, we have a symbol. And symbols are basically an abstract representation of an image. So if we take, let's say, an elephant, well, our symbols would be the letters ELEPHANT, because those letters, those squiggles, have nothing to do with elephants. Therefore, it makes it abstract. But they represent the elephants. So in this way, they work as a symbol because it has nothing to do with what the actual thing is, but it is a symbolic representation of it. The third unit of thought is the concept or schema. Hopefully we remember that from development that schemas start off really broad, concepts of things start off really broad, and this is when we categorize multiple things that all have at least a few similar characteristics. Right? Like if we said animals, that would be a schema right there. Then you could put dogs and cats and cows and elephants and chickens. But if I said dogs, which would be a smaller, more distinct schema or concept, then it's like labs, golden retrievers, German shepherds, Dobermans, things like that. So the concept or the schema, a way we categorize things that have similar characteristics, is the third unit of thought. The fourth unit of thought is the prototype. And the prototype is the representation of that schema, of that concept that first comes to your mind, right? So if I said animals, a lot of you probably think dog. Maybe some of you think cats, but probably very few of you are thinking jellyfish, right? Because these are things that are more common. They are the prototype for the concept or the schema, but doesn't represent it all the way. And then finally, you have a rule, and a rule is a statement that links multiple concepts or schemas together. All right, are there any questions? I mean, I don't think that you'd have to if you're like thinking like as a whole, I would say that they are from the different ways in which humans can develop thought from the most simple to the most complex. I think that's the best way I would describe it. So the way that humans use thought, or the types of thoughts that humans have, that from the most simple to the most complex. And yeah, Isaac, for the last one, the rule is that's when you have a statement that links multiple concepts or schemas together. Yeah. If I say, I go, I go to the store and buy juice, then all of a sudden I'm linking multiple concepts together with a statement with that rule there, because I'm linking the store, which is a type of business, juice, which is a beverage. Maybe if I say I go by car, it's a type of transportation, and so on. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, generally, I rarely see the rule one, but I see what I see the most is the schema, and I see the prototype and the symbol. Those ones you tend to see a little bit more on the AP exam. I would say that those are probably a little bit higher priority to like understand and remember than an image or than the rule too. All right. So let's look at the next one with 4 votes, and that's the types of thought. All right. So we have some different types of thinking when we talk about thought itself. The first one is directed thinking. So directed thinking is the thinking that we do when someone or something directs you on how to think. I mean, I know that's kind of like self-explanatory, but it's more like if I say think about elephants, that's directed thinking. If you have directions on a paper, that's directed thinking because it tells you how to think about the questions you're about to do. If I say what's the capital of California, that's directed thinking. Even a math formula, for example, is directed thinking. And so when we look at that, we can see that most of the thought that we do is directed. All right, and then for directed thinking, it's the type of thinking you do when someone or something tells you how to think or instructs you on how to think. All right, and then we have non-directed thinking. Non-directed thinking is, well, pretty much it's that thinking that you do when you just let your mind wander. So it's like the type of thinking that you do, um, where you're just you coming up with new ideas, or you're just thinking about what the weather's going to be like, or what happened to you last week, or whatever. But nobody or anything is instructing you on how to think. It's like the kind of thought that you do when you're in the shower, right? When you don't have anything to kind of guide you and just let your mind wander. Yeah, definitely daydreaming is non-directed thinking. Absolutely. Then you have metacognition. Metacognition is when you are thinking about thinking. It's always one of my favorites. So this is if someone said, uh, how would you tell someone to do this thing? You have to think about the instructions you're going to give. The instructions you're going to give is a form of directed thinking. So because you're thinking about the instructions you're giving, you are thinking about thinking. Therefore, it's metacognition. When you do a math problem and the formulas are given for you or not given for you, and you have to think about which formula to use before you actually solve the problem, well, that's metacognition because the formulas are a form of directed thinking. And then we have concrete and abstract thought. Concrete thought is when we are thinking about things that are specifically connected to a larger idea, specifically connected to things that are tangible, things that you can experience. Abstract thought is things that are not connected to what you're experiencing, things that are outside of what your immediate environment is sensing. So when you talk about ideas, when you think about ideas that are not immediately connected to the problems you're trying to solve, when you're thinking about just random type of stuff that is a little bit more about ideas and less about like things, people, place, or things, then those ideas become abstract. All right. Do you guys have any questions here about the units of thought? Okay, for those of you who's it's your first times to these, basically what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take the next one with 4 votes, and even though it's from a different unit. So once I finish all the ones with 4 votes, I'll go do the ones that have 3 votes in the cognitive psych unit, and then we'll kind of work our way through each time. In the personality and intelligence unit, there's only one of them that you guys put as having 4 votes, and that's the Big Five and the MMPI. So these are both the primary trait based personality tests that are considered very scientific, very reliable, and valid. The MMPI stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. You don't need to know specifically how many questions it has, but you should know that it's a trait based personality test, that is very scientific, and probably that the traits it measures are related to mental health, to clinical psychology. The Big Five is stuff that you see all the time. Often there will be a Big Five bullet point on an FRQ. Not like all of the Big Five, but a single part of the Big Five, like the Big Five trait of extroversion or something like that. So remember that with the Big Five, what we want to look at is we want to look at ocean or canoe. That's our mnemonic right there. That's our acronym that we want to use. And it stands for the 5 distinct characteristics that make up the Big Five. We'll use ocean just because why not, right? Because I want to go to the ocean. So O will stand for openness. That's like open to new ideas and open to new experiences. So that kind of measures like how open-minded or closed-minded you are. The C stands for conscientiousness, and that's like how organized you are, and how like task-oriented you are. The E stands for extroversion, and that has to do with how social you are. The A stands for agreeableness, and that's how kind you are, and how helpful you are. And the N stands for neuroticism, and that's your emotional stability. People always ask how to spell neuroticism. All right. Are there any questions there? All right. Now we're going to move into abnormal psych, the ones that got 4 votes here. We're going to start, even though it's a little bit lower on the list. I think it just makes more sense to start with this one. And that is the eclectic approach to treatment. So the eclectic approach to treatment is basically um, when clinical psychologists or psychiatrists, when they use a combination of different types of psychotherapy and biomedical therapies in order to treat mental illness. All right, questions there? All right, we're going to fly through these tonight. Okay, so the next thing that people wanted covered in abnormal psych were the personality disorders, cluster A, B, and C. So there are 10 total personality disorders, split between three clusters. Each cluster uh, is kind of has distinct set of characteristics, but obviously within each one of these, each personality disorder is at least somewhat different. So let's just kind of go through it all. All right, we're going to start with cluster A. So cluster A are disorders are characterized by odd and kind of eccentric thinking and behavior. The first one on there is paranoid PD. I'm going to use the acronym or the initials PD for personality disorder because saying that every time is just way too much. So paranoid PD is like basically a big distrust of others, suspicion of others and their motives. Um, they hold grudges, hostile to insults, but basically the general idea is that there is extreme distrust and suspicion of others and their motives. Schizoid personality disorder is when someone has a lack of interest in social and personal relationships and kind of prefers to be alone most of the time. So doesn't really connect with others in social situations, doesn't pick up with social cues, little no emotion, and so on. But the general idea with schizoid is that they just want to be alone. And I'll write some of these out because I know spelling is a little bit weird. That's schizoid. And the last one is in cluster A is schizotypal. Uh, and schizotypal is very, very bizarre and peculiar thinking, beliefs, ways of talking, and even the way that you dress. Like people with schizotypal PD have like what they call magical thinking, where they believe that they can influence people and the events with their thoughts. They have a lot of discomfort with close relationships because they're just really, really kind of weird. Uh, and sometimes they may even hear voices. All right, questions on cluster A. All right, cluster B is characterized by dramatic and emotional behavior, thoughts and behavior. There are 4 in cluster B. So this is kind of the biggest one. And generally, for the most part, when you see questions about personality disorders, they're often about one of the ones in cluster B. Sometimes cluster A, sometimes cluster C, but mostly what I've seen is cluster B. So probably the one that is kind of most well known is antisocial personality disorder. And antisocial PD is a lack of empathy and a disregard for other people's needs and feelings. So in antisocial PD, this is where you get like serial killers because it doesn't bother them to hurt somebody else. but it's also where you get people like CEOs of Fortune 500 companies because it doesn't bother them to fire 5,000 people who will then go starving. Oftentimes, people with antisocial PD will have problems with the law. They'll often be really aggressive and violent, and certainly also very impulsive. Borderline PD, the second one, is when someone carries out impulsive and risky behavior because they are extremely emotionally unstable. So oftentimes they're very fragile, they're very sensitive. They'll have up and down moods. Certainly feelings of emptiness, frequent mood swings, displays of anger, um, and this is all tied to their emotional instability. Just think about it this way: with borderline PD, they're on the border between stable and unstable. All right, the third one is histrionic personality disorder. And this is extreme attention seeking. So, sexual promiscuity, extremely emotional, um, easily influenced by others, is always excessive concern with physical appearance, um, uh, is always talking about how close they are and how much attention they get from other people. But it's essentially very much attention seeking. Everything they do is to gain the attention. And then the fourth one is narcissistic PD. And narcissistic PD is basically the one where you want everyone to notice you and to kind of like worship you. It's where where a person will thrive off the adulation of others. So they think that they're very powerful and successful, and everybody else should recognize that too. They often will fail to recognize other people's feelings, though, and certainly uh, will always kind of be unreasonably expect that to be given favors and advantages. All right, questions on cluster B. Pretty straightforward. So, yes and no. So, one could have narcissism, but not have it be so extreme that it counts as a personality disorder. Um, so, it has to be to a certain level that makes it become a PD. Other people are attention seeking, but not all attention seeking are histrionic. You know, Definitely there are people who are emotionally unstable, but not every emotionally unstable person is borderline. So that's the kind of the idea. PDs are when it's consistent, and it's been consistent for a significant period of time, um, and, and certainly alters the way a person lives their life. It's a good question, though. All right, cluster C, the last cluster of them all, is characterized by anxious and fearful behaviors. There are three in cluster C. Avoidant PD is people who are have an extreme fear of disapproval, embarrassment, or ridicule. which makes them avoid all social situations that could create embarrassment or disapproval or rejection. They often will feel very inferior, inadequate, and unattractive, um, and will avoid meeting like new people and strangers. Dependent PD is someone who has a dependence on others, and they feel the need to be taken care of. They're often incredibly clingy and submissive uh, because they are fearful of having to self care. They lack the confidence and reassurance to make their own decisions and need other people to do it for them. All right, and then finally, there is OCPD, or obsessive compulsive PD. And obsessive compulsive PD is different from OCD, though not much. Um, with It's different because it's not as connected to the obsessions and compulsions, but more just the preoccupation with details and orderliness and rules. They are often extreme perfectionists. So not every perfectionist has OCD because they may not have that compulsive behavior. But OCPD is basically extreme perfectionism. When perfection isn't achieved, there's extreme distress because then you don't meet your own standards. That person doesn't meet their own standards. Often they'll be incredibly rigid, inflexible, um, uh, and will often even neglect like relationships in order to have commitment to things like work. All right, that's the personality disorders. Any questions? The second one, wait, what did I just say? Oh, was dependent. It's when that person can't make decisions for themselves. They're clingy, submissive, overly dependent on other people because they're fearful that they'll make the mistakes. You're welcome. All right. Any questions? All right. And the last one with 4 votes in abnormal psych is ECT and RTMS. This will be a really fast one. So ECT stands for electroconvulsive therapy, and RTMS stands for repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. They both treat the same thing, which is depression. Generally, they're used for major depression that psychotherapy and other biomedical therapies can't fix. Electroconvulsive therapy is when a person a person is given electricity to electroconvulsive therapy. Okay. And there you go. So electroconvulsive therapy is when electricity is used to stimulate different brain structures that will elevate a person's mood. It doesn't just happen once. They need to usually go through like a 12-week session where they do like one a week. Um, it's often misunderstood because people see it as torturous, but it's not. The people don't feel it because they're given a sedative. The one side effect it has is some minor short-term memory loss, but certainly its success in treating major depression is, in many cases, worth the side effect. RTMS does exactly the same thing, except instead of using electricity, it will use magnetism. It's not as effective as ECT, but so it's a little bit weaker, but at the same time, it doesn't come with the memory loss side effects. All right. Questions here. Excellent. Good. Let's go back to cognitive psych and hit the ones that got 3 votes now. Okay. So the first one here is sensory memory. Sensory memory is the most basic form of memory that we have. It shows up in 2 different forms, iconic and echoic memory. Iconic is the visual form of it, whereas echoic is the auditory form of it. And sensory memory can be retained for about 3 seconds. It's basically the idea that many times you're not even aware of all the different like light energy that's entering into your brain or sounds that are entering into your brain, but your brain still registers them. If you don't pay attention to that stimulus, then after 3 seconds, it's gone out of your brain. You don't remember it. If you do pay attention, however, then it gets moved into your short-term memory, where using rehearsal, you can then encode it into your long-term memory. But sensory memory itself is the basic form of memory that our brain takes in both visual light energy and sounds, and many times we don't even realize we're registering them because we don't pay attention to them. And if we don't pay attention, then after 3 seconds, they're gone. All right. Are there questions about sensory memory? All right. The next one is implicit, explicit, and episodic memories. All right. So with implicit, explicit, and episodic, these are different types of memories that we have. They're stored in different locations within the brain, and they are very much assigned to different aspects of our memory. So implicit memory is the memories that we have of physical skills. So kind of like muscle memory. So this is walking, running, dribbling a basketball, driving a car, writing. All of these are different forms of implicit memories. It's the actual actions of them. Because pretty much all of these implicit memories are connected to coordination, and in many cases balance. These memories are stored in our cerebellum, the part of the brain that's devoted to coordination and balance. Explicit memories are memories of facts. Sometimes they're called declarative memories. By the way, implicit memories are also sometimes called procedural, because it has to do with the physical procedures. And explicit memories are those declarative memories, the memories that we can declare. We can say, this is the information. So declarative memories are stored in our hippocampus. the primary center for memory. It's where you remember what, like the order of things you learn in school. It's where you remember what you had for breakfast yesterday. It's where you remember the the types of things that you need to get at the grocery store. All of these are explicit memories. They're memories that you can declare. And the third type are episodic memories. Now, episodic memories can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but essentially what they are is the memory of events within your life, memories of experiences. But here's the thing. If you said, what did you have for breakfast yesterday? And you said, I had cereal, that's a declarative memory. But if you visualize yourself eating the cereal yesterday, then it's episodic. So it's the experience itself. But sometimes the script of like what happened in that experience, that part is explicit, it's declarative, but the experience itself is episodic. Oftentimes there is an emotional connection to our episodic memories. And when we have extreme emotional connections, we could say that those are flashbulb memories. These tend to be stored within both the hippocampus and the amygdala because of the emotional connection to them. All right, questions on these three? Kind of four, but mostly three. All right. Okay, the next one is priming mood congruence in the serial position effect. Yeah, so with some of these things, I didn't want to create like a different like box for all of these. It'd just be way too much. So I combined things together. So priming mood congruence and the serial position effect are all ways that we can get a person to think about some specific pieces of information. With priming, it's if a concept is established in someone's brain, then they will be more likely to think about things connected to that concept. You may remember in the lecture when I did this, it was a while back, so if you don't remember, it's fine. But you may remember what I did is I said, spell the word hair. Everyone spells it H-A-I-R. And then I show you a picture of a bunny rabbit, which is that concept that sometimes bunnies are called hares, and there's a different way of spelling it. And I say, now spell hair again. And it allows you to think about the idea that there's an alternate spelling to the word hair. Because I primed your brain by presenting it with a conceptual idea connected to it. Mood congruence is the idea that we will remember our episodic memories and even our declarative memories in a positive or negative context, depending on our emotional state. So if our mood is good, we're gonna think about things in a positive light. If our mood is bad, we're probably going to think about those things negatively. It doesn't really work in the virtual setting, but every year I do this. When I do it in class, I tell people that I ask one person who's having a bad day or a good day, and I say, tell me about your parents. And so they're thinking about the memories of their parents, and they're like, oh, they're kind and helpful and nice. Now, are those parents always going to be kind, helpful, and nice? Probably not, because parents are parents, right? But then I ask somebody else who's having a bad day, what are your parents like? And they're controlling and they're strict and they're unreasonable and they won't let me do anything and so on. Now, is that the only thing those parents do? Also, probably not. It's probably somewhere in the middle. But because of those two people's emotional states, they're recollecting that information, that memory, in one light versus another. And finally, there's the serial position effect. The serial position effect says that when we're given many pieces of information, especially if they're not connected, we tend to remember the ones at the beginning and at the end. The stuff in the middle, we tend not to remember. And this has to do with both recency and primacy. Primacy being the first things we are instructed to learn or to think about, and recency being the last ones. So primacy effect says the first things you think about are things you're going to remember because it was the first ones. Recency says the last things that you thought about you're going to remember because it was the most recent. But it's those ones in the center that not so much. All right, questions here. All right, knocking some of these out. Okay, we're going to go into personality and intelligence. And okay, we're going to be doing reliability and validity. All right, we're going to start with reliability. So reliability is the idea that when you take an assessment, if you take it more than once, then you're going to get the same score or a similar score. So there are 4 types of reliability. We have split half reliability, which says that if you take an assessment and split it in half, then you're going to do about equally on one half of it versus the other. If it's split half reliable, your scores within the 2 halves should be about equal. There's alternate form reliability. And alternate form reliability basically says that if you're given an alternate version of the assessment, you're going to do basically very similar. There's test-retest reliability, which says that if you take the test once and then you take it a second time, you're going to do about the same. Though rehearsal actually plays a really big role. Most likely you'll probably do better. And finally, the last one is inter-rater reliability. And inter-rater reliability is when you're taking an assessment that involves subjectivity, basically meaning like somebody's opinion. And between 2 different raters who are giving their opinions, or more even, but at least 2, they give you generally the same score. So the best way to think about this, for those of you who are taking like AP Lang or AP Lit, you have those writing samples you have to do. Those writing samples are scored once by one person and then once again by a second person. Now they have a rubric, but ultimately it comes down to that person's opinion, to how good your writing was, right? So inter-rater reliability would mean that you get similar scores from each person scoring it. Questions on the 4 types of reliability? Okay. Validity is when an assessment covers what it's supposed to. when the assessment measures basically what it's supposed to. There are 5 types of validity. There's content validity, which this is for assessments that cover concrete ideas. So, like, for example, in psychology, there are a bunch of facts. Either you know them or you don't, right? So, in chemistry, you have problems. Either you know it or you don't. And so, if you have an exam or an assessment that measures something that either you know it or you don't, that would be content valid, assuming it is covering what it's supposed to be covering. Like, if it's a chemistry exam and you've got and you've got classical art on it, then not content valid. But if it's a chemistry exam and you've got chemistry questions on it, then certainly yes. The second one is construct validity. And construct validity is like content validity, but for tests that are more dynamic and subjective. So with these ones, we're talking about like intelligence exams, right? There's no one single way to define the intelligence, right? Or personality exams or personality assessments. These are both things that, assuming they have questions about personality stuff related to personality or stuff related to intelligence, then we could say that they are construct valid. There's face validity, and face validity is basically at face value, does the test cover what it's supposed to? Sorry, I just blanked on for a second. Okay. Content, construct, face. Hold on. Somebody help me out here. I'm literally, my brain just shut off for a second.
Criterion?
Yeah, there's criterion. So criterion, and predictive validity. I'm sorry. So criterion validity, and thank you guys for that. Criterion validity is when an exam or an assessment measures whether or not it's two things are correlated. So between the results of your assessment and another one, are those correlated together? Things that are related to one another. Do they show correlation? If you do well in chemistry and then well in biology, then you could say those two assessments are criterionally related because there's a correlation between the two because of the overlap for the material. And then finally, we have predictive validity. And predictive validity is the validity that we use for assessments to measure future success, to predict something in the future, but in many cases, future success. The SAT, the IQ test are both predictively valid. Thank you guys for that. Any questions? All right. So we hit reliability and validity. Good. Okay. Now we're going to get into some of the ones that got 3 votes in abnormal psych. There's like 3 of them. So one is the medical model and the DSM-5. So the medical model is the process that clinical psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illness. Basically, it works the same way. Why it's called the medical model, it works the same way if you go in for a physical illness. Like, let's say you go in with, you drop something on your foot. You go into the doctor's office. You say, my foot hurts. I dropped a cinder block on it. And then the doctor will maybe run some tests. We'll look at it and say, you have a broken foot. here's the treatment. We're going to give you a cast. We're going to give you some painkillers. We're going to give you crutches. There you go. With mental illness, it works the same way. You go and you see a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, and you tell them, this is what's going on with me. Now, it's based on the mental side of you and not the physical side. So it's more about your thoughts and your feelings and even your behaviors too. And then they will, based on what you tell them, they will diagnose you and then suggest treatment. And that's the medical model. So it's the same model that we use when trying to treat physical illness. We use that same type of model for mental illness. We can get into issues with diagnoses, though. If someone gets a label, sometimes it can cause, other people, including even other medical professionals, to ignore some of their behaviors and their thoughts and feelings because they say, oh, well, that person just got anxiety or that person just has depression. So in that case, the labels, the diagnostic labels, can be a little bit harmful at times. It can also make people feel really bad about themselves, right? Oh my God, I have anxiety, or oh my God, I have depression, right? We have these connotations in our society about mental illness. And so certainly those labels don't make people feel good. The DSM is the manual that is used to help diagnose mental illness. It's called the DSM-5 because it's the 5th edition. And each edition is changed every 20 to 30 odd years to reflect the changing ideas and viewpoints about mental illness in our society. Like I always make the case that, for example, in the first 2 DSMs, homosexuality was considered a mental illness. By DSM-3, the changing viewpoints about homosexuality within our society caused them to remove that from the DSM. And obviously, we're in the 5th edition now, and it's relatively new. I think the 5th edition came out like 2007, maybe something like that, 2009. So it's pretty new. And it gives information about symptoms and how to diagnose and what kinds of things you got to look for different types of mental illness. It's really gigantic. The actual like physical DSM, it's like 900 pages. All right, questions here. All right, the next one with 3 votes were somatoform disorders. Somatoform disorders are mental illnesses, psychological disorders that have to do with people feeling like they have physical symptoms of illness or injury without any physical kind of reason for that symptom or feeling. Within somatoform disorders, we had 3 specific disorders. 2 were really common, and 1 was a lot less common. So the really rare one is conversion disorders, and a conversion disorder is when somebody experiences the loss of some major physical part of themselves with no specific reason, but the actual reason is some sort of anxiety and fear that the person is experiencing. So this might be losing their ability to walk, losing their ability to see or to hear. Certainly, like I read a story about a pilot that was involved with a plane crash that lost his ability to see, because if he can't see, he can't fly, and then he can't be flying a plane that might crash. Generally, people with conversion disorders don't really have much alarm about their condition, even though it's obviously quite serious, which shows us that they don't have that alarm because that allows them to not have to deal with their anxiety and fear.
The other two in somatoform disorders are quite common. Somatic symptom disorder is when someone has a whole bunch of physical symptoms, like they're actually experiencing lots of pain or headaches or or some sort of like problems with like breathing or heartbeat, but there's no physical reason for it, but it's primarily linked to psychosomatic evidence of anxiety and fear. So a lot of times people, especially those who may think like there's something bad about mental illness, they don't want to admit they have a mental illness. So instead they'll go into the hospital because they're experiencing like a racing heartbeat or major pain and nausea in their stomach or extreme headaches. And it turns out that those things are tied to their mind. They're tied to their mental state, whether it's depression or anxiety or something else like that. And so that mental state is causing a physiological response, and that physiological response is what they're feeling. And then finally, there's illness anxiety disorder. And illness anxiety disorder is when someone experiences a normal minor physical symptom like a headache or like a muscle ache or like nausea. And instead of accepting the actual like rational reason why they should have that, instead they think it's something that is much, much worse. They think that that's evidence of having some sort of major illness or kind of like physical type of condition. And that's what they have anxiety about. They're like, oh my God, I see a mole on my skin. I must have skin cancer. So now they get very scared and anxiety about having some sort of major disease, despite the fact that the most likely the symptoms that they're experiencing are normal day-to-day aches and pains. All right, questions about somatoform disorders. All right, the other one with 3 in this topic was Beck's cognitive therapy. Beck's cognitive therapy, designed by Aaron Beck, who's a really famous cognitive psychologist. Beck's cognitive cognitive therapy, excuse me, is about treating depression, specifically depression. They use, in Beck's cognitive therapy, he uses some of the same logical techniques that you find in REBT and rational emotive behavior therapy, but without the sort of aggressiveness that you'd find in REBT. If you remember, REBT involves having a lot of kind of aggressive tendencies and aggressive challenging of people. Well, Beck's cognitive therapy wants to use logic to show that what people are thinking when they're depressed isn't necessarily what's really happening, but it does it in a really gentle way, in a non-aggressive way. Beck always believed that REBT was not good for people with depression because when they were given that kind of aggressive treatment, many patients that he had just felt worse about themselves because they were being, yelled at and being treated aggressively. All right, questions here. Okay, we're going to move into the ones with 2 votes now. So let's go to it. We'll go back to cognitive psych and kind of hit a bunch of these really fast. I think the 2-vote ones, there's a lot of these in each of the 3 units. So we're going to kind of go speed round on this. Well, maybe not. It's like 723. So, but we'll still go fairly quick because there's a lot there. All right. One is automatic. The first one that we're going to cover is automatic and effortful processing. So, automatic and effortful processing refers to when we're processing information that we will eventually remember. Automatic processing is ones that we do without any real awareness. And that can even be things that we've learned before because we just kind of go through the motions again, or it can be things that we're not paying attention to. Effortful processing are those things that we're experiencing that we're paying very distinct attention to. That we'll tend to encode those a little bit deeper that way too. Questions? Okay. Let's see. The next one is visual, acoustic, and semantic encoding. So this is basically when talking about language specifically, how shallow or deep we process stuff connected to the language. So visual encoding, which is a form of shallow processing, which means that we'll take the information in, but it's hard to remember because it's shallowly processed. Visual encoding is when we have no personal connection to the words that we're seeing, so meaning that they're not even letters that we recognize, and we have to remember not only what they mean, but also like what what the word is and so on. And visual encoding has really, really low retention. Like if I showed you a word in Arabic, most likely you guys probably wouldn't remember it. Unless somebody here knows and speaks Arabic, in which case then maybe. Semantic encoding is when we process the sound of that of a set of words, of a word or words. Did I say semantic? I meant acoustic. I'm sorry. So acoustic. It's been a long night. Sorry, you guys. Acoustic encoding is when we remember the sounds. I'm going to get to semantic just because semantics is more deep. But acoustic is when we remember the sounds. Acoustic is also a form of shallow processing, but has a better retention rate than visual. And the reason for that is because if we hear a word in another language, we might be able to remember it, especially if we can rhyme it or have it be like, oh, that sounds like something that we know, like a word that we know. So both visual and acoustic are forms of shallow processing, whereas semantic, Isaiah, now we're here, semantic is the form of processing that we take when it involves meaning. So when we're able to develop a connection to it, when it means something to us, we process it much, much more deeply, and we'll be able to retain that information much, much more effectively. All right, questions here. All right, next one is LTP, long-term potentiation. Excuse me. LTP, or long-term potentiation, is the biological evidence, or the evidence that memory is a biological process. When we're experiencing something for the first time, when we're learning something for the first time,
when we're doing some sort of physical skill for the first time. The neurons in our, or the neurotransmitters in our brain cells, in our neurons, cross the synapse at a steady, consistent rate. But when we are doing something from memory, when it's, let's say, we're practicing a physical skill, or when we're trying to recollect information that we've learned prior, what ends up occurring is that neurotransmission increases in rate. Basically, when we're first experiencing it, those neurotransmitters are moving kind of slow. But each time we do this same thing again and again and again, those neurotransmitters begin to move faster and faster and faster, showing that the connections that our brain is making are improving based on prior experience. So LTP is that evidence that memory is a biological process, because we see increased rates of neurotransmission when doing things connected to memory. All right. Any questions there? Okay. Okay. So the next one will be proactive versus retroactive interference. This should go fairly quickly. This is when we forget, but it's forgetting specifically in the retrieval stage of memory. And for both of these, interference occurs when we can't remember one piece of information because our brain can only think about something similarly or something that's related and it's similar. With all instances of this, there's always going to be a new information and an old information, right? Like there's always going to be one that we've learned prior and one that we learned sooner. With proactive interference, this is when newer information is forgotten because it's too similar to older stuff. Retroactive interference is the opposite. It's when older information is forgotten because it's too similar to the new stuff. Questions there? All right, the next one is false memory construction. False memory construction is when we recollect a memory, but we do it in a way that it didn't actually take place. In fact, all of our memories are reconstructed, but a lot of times we just get most of it right. But in some cases, we'll get it really, really wrong. Sometimes this can be due to the misinformation effect, where given faulty pieces of information about some experience, we're gonna construct that memory in a way that includes that faulty piece of information. Sometimes it's even just our imagination. The imagination effect does basically the same thing, but rather than somebody else give us that faulty piece of information, our imagination is what's doing it. And we build that imagined kind of idea into that recollected memory of an experience.
And we may even have something like deja vu, in which with deja vu, we are reconstructing a memory from a past experience or a dream that's so similar to what we're experiencing in that moment that it feels the same. But the problem is that when we're reconstructing that old memory, it's not actually the same, but we're adding stuff that we're experiencing right now into that old memory to change it.
Okay, questions here. All right, next one. Functional fixedness and the confirmation bias. All right, functional fixedness and confirmation bias are both two different types of cognitive biases, meaning that our cognition or our mental thoughts bias how we are being biased. Functional fixedness is when we can only think about how to use an object by its intended purpose. When we start using objects for an unintended purpose, like, for example, using a butter knife to screw in a screw, which, by the way, really works, then that could be said to be overcoming functional fixedness. But functional fixedness itself is a cognitive bias where we can only think about how to use an object for its intended purpose. Oh, nice. You can confirm it too, Josh. Nice. The confirmation bias is connected to our beliefs. And this is when we give more credit to information and also people's opinions that back up our own. Oh, nice. I haven't tried that one, but I will. So confirmation bias is when we readily accept pieces of information or other people's opinions that confirm our own beliefs, that tell us that we're right. And at the same time, we're also more likely to discount or try to basically ignore information or people's opinions that go against our beliefs. Because we don't like being told that we're wrong. We don't like being shown that we're wrong. And so this basically causes people to create false beliefs in many occasions and adds to all of that belief perseverance and availability and representativeness heuristics and all of that, because people are using this and are more accepting certain beliefs that are being confirmed by those who share them as well. Twitter is a good place to experience the confirmation bias. Facebook. All right, questions here. All right, the next one is heuristics. We are almost done with the cognitive psych ones that got 2 votes. So, heuristics. There are 3 primary heuristics. Heuristics are a problem-solving technique where we use a rule of thumb, kind of like our own beliefs, to create a mental shortcut. Now, in many cases, heuristics are right because we use our own beliefs to kind of help us and assist us in solving problems. But when our beliefs are incorrect, then that's where we run into trouble. And there are 3 types of heuristics. There is the availability heuristic. And the availability heuristic says that we solve problems based on the information that's available to us.
So if we say, I don't want to fly in a plane because I just read an article about plane crashes, well, you're not reading that article that shows all the different planes that take off and land without any problems. So you're basing it on incomplete information. The representativeness heuristic says that we can solve problems based on information that's based on our prototypes and our stereotypes. So the representativeness heuristic, if you look at a person walking down the street and they've got a leather jacket on and boots and wraparound sunglasses, we're like, that guy's a biker. But we don't know it for sure, right? And so we base our judgments and our ability to solve problems based on those prototypes that we see. But sometimes those prototypes aren't correct. And especially this can be dangerous when it involves stereotypes, where all of a sudden we say that person is in the wrong because they're this type of person. And then finally, we have the anchoring heuristic. And the anchoring heuristic basically says that once we have an established mental belief, we cling to it. And we're willing to leave it at least somewhat, but generally not that far. Generally, we're not going to get too far away from our anchor. So even if we see a problem, we have this established belief about how to solve it, we may try things that are very similar to it because we're not leaving too far from our anchor, but we may not go and try something completely different because that's way beyond our anchor. All right, questions here. All right, and the last two, which will go together, are language and linguistic relativity theory. So, language, generally, as long as you know that language is a cognitive process, because we have to connect a set of sounds to conceptual ideas and assign meaning to them. And so our brain has to make that cognitive link. We also need to know about morphemes and phonemes. Morphemes being that basic unit of sound. So in many cases, like a consonant is a morpheme. So like V, T, L, M, because they make V, T, O, M, and so on. And then vowels usually have multiple morphemes because they make different sounds, right? Like the A vowel can make the A sound, the ah sound, and the ah sound. Those are three distinct sets of sounds. And then you also even have two-letter consonant phonemes like SH, sh, or CH, ch, and so on. And that's interesting. Yeah, because it's German. Yeah, but you're right. You're right. Mercedes has three different ways of pronouncing E, three different phonemes. Morphemes are basic units of meaning. So morphemes are like if you have a word and then you add some letters onto it and it changes its meaning, then that thing that you added on is a second morpheme. So like if you had the word cat and then you add an S onto it, which creates cats, that changes the meaning from a single animal to many animals. So that S is a separate morpheme. All suffixes and prefixes are morphemes. And certainly, the longer the word, the more additions it tends to have and the more changes to its overall meaning. So when you're looking to see if there's a question about how many morphemes are in a certain word, which there might be a question like that, then look for the base word. If the base word is solo and it's on its own, then it's just one. But if the base word kind of then has additions to it, like preconceived, right? Preconceived has pre meaning before, conceive meaning this new idea, and the D at the end implies that it's in the past. So that would be then three morphemes. With language, you also have syntax rules. Like every language has separate syntax rules about like what goes first, nouns, verbs, or adjectives, and what goes second. So it's a way of structuring sentences. And then certainly the semantics of words are the meanings to them. It's how our brain makes a connection between that set of sounds and the overall meaning to the word. The linguistic relativity theory, which certainly goes along with this stuff because it's language, the linguistic relativity theory says that people can only think in words that are created by their home language. Now, that was the original idea. Certainly, like if we can think about those, we can think about certain words based on the vocabulary that we've established in our culture, and yet today we know that linguistic relativity theory is a little bit altered. So the initial thought was the words create the thoughts. Now what we know is that it's the thoughts. There can be thoughts that we don't have words for, but the words influence how we think about things. So, like for example, if I did this, I'm like clapping with my fingers. There's no word for this process. Maybe finger clapping, but that's kind of weird. Not specifically with these three fingers, right? But we can think about that even though there isn't a word for it. So now we just basically know that that culture and the language that stems from the culture influences heavily on our way of thinking. All right, questions here. Okay. Wow, we have a lot of stuff with 2 votes in personality and intelligence. So I'm going to go through it in the speed round. So we're running a little short on time now, and I do want to make sure that I can get to the abnormal psych stuff that's covered. In fact, you know what? Looking at the abnormal psych stuff, there's only 4 things. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cover those 4 abnormal psych things with 2 votes first, and then we'll go back to the personality and intelligence stuff, and we'll get through what we get through. So in abnormal psych, the next thing we'll look at is impulse control disorders. Impulse control disorders are when somebody has trouble controlling their impulsiveness, but to the point where it's a disorder, as they go through 5 distinct behavioral stages where they experience that impulse, that urge to do something that's probably kind of wrong. And then they usually wait and don't do it, but they'll experience a growing tension. Then they'll do the thing. Then they'll give in and give into the impulse. And then that will feel good because it's what they wanted to do in the first place. But also they'll experience relief because they'll eliminate that tension that comes from not giving into the impulse. And then in many cases, they'll feel guilt. Three impulse control disorders that you do need to know about. They're all very simple. All of them have to do with impulses to do a specific behavior. Pyromania is the impulse to light fires. Kleptomania is the impulse to steal. And pathological gambling disorder is the impulse to go and place bets. Questions here? The autism spectrum disorders are a wide range of disorders on a general spectrum. The general spectrum all is connected, though, to a person's lack of social development. So generally, autism spectrum disorders appear when people are when they're children, and they'll usually be incredibly socially impaired, meaning that they won't understand social norms or what's appropriate behavior in certain social situations. Oftentimes, language also becomes a big issue. And when language is an issue because they're not connecting socially to help learn the language, that leads to learning disabilities. And certainly, you also have Asperger's syndrome. And Asperger's syndrome is basically on the autism spectrum, but it's more high functioning because people with Asperger's syndrome lack the language difficulties. All right, questions here. All right, the next one is in a portion of the therapy, free association, resistance, and transference. So this is all part of psychoanalytic therapy. In this one, the psychologist will instruct someone to just talk about whatever they want. And that's that free association part. That's when a person just kind of speaks about whatever's on their mind, from the very serious to not so serious at all. Basically, what the psychologist is looking to do is looking to find those topics that the person is resistant to speaking about. Those topics that they're resistant to speaking about then will give the psychologist indications about unconscious influences towards certain things or past childhood things in their unconscious that might affect that resistance. And then in many cases, transference occurs. And transference is when a person begins to develop similar feelings towards their therapist that they feel towards other people that are important. So basically, they transfer the feelings from that important personal relationship to the relationship with the therapist. So in some cases, it can make the relationship strain with the therapist. In some cases, it can make them want to date the therapist, and so on and so forth, depending on the feeling that they're experiencing. Questions here? All right, and then the last one in this one is psychopharmacology, and that's basically medication, biomedical treatments for different types of disorders. We have antipsychotic medication, which is an antagonist, so it blocks dopamine receptors, and by blocking the dopamine receptors, it limits the dopamine reactions, which then eliminate the hallucinations with schizophrenia. There's anti-anxiety medication. That's things like Valium and Xanax. And that medication just slows someone down. They're tranquilizers, so they're designed to be depressants, and they slow things down to the point where a person their body and mind isn't racing with anxiety. But there's a high tendency of addiction, of habituation with that medication, where a person may start popping pills anytime they feel any instance of anxiety, ultimately to the point where they will pop pills to feel normal. Antidepressants are things like Prozac, and antidepressants are agonists, which means they increase the reaction. Yeah, so dependency, absolutely, Josh. So antidepressants are agonists, which means they increase the reaction of neurotransmitters, specifically serotonin, though sometimes some forms of them will do it with norepinephrine too. But serotonin is that neurotransmitter linked to mood. And what these drugs will do, they're called SSRIs, and which stands for selective serotonin. I'll write it. Reuptake inhibitor. And that blocks the reuptake process, which keeps serotonin in the synapse for a longer period of time, increasing these serotonin reactions and artificially elevating somebody's mood. And then there's lithium carbonate, and lithium carbonate is a simple salt that's used for people with bipolar disorder to help regulate and kind of like limit the mood swings that they get. So make it so the mood swings are not so extreme. All right, any questions here? All right, so let's go back up to personality and intelligence. I don't think we're going to get through all of this stuff because there's a lot, and it's a lot to it, but I will try to get through as much as I can. So we're going to start with Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality, and that's all about the id, ego, and superego. The id is the devil, the superego is the angel, and the ego is the referee. That's all tied to your unconscious. So when you do something bad, it's the id, or think about something's bad, it's the id's influence on your conscious thought. The superego is the ideal of what you're unconsciously what you're supposed to do, and the ego is a way to satisfy tries to satisfy the urges of the id while still maintaining the ideals of the superego. All right, questions here. Psychodynamic theories of personality, which is the next one from Jung and Adler, will look at the unconscious and childhood, but without any of the weird, violent sexual stuff that Freud likes to talk about. So for Carl Jung, that was where he said that there's a collective unconscious, where our unconscious is ideas that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And the more distinctly they get passed down into individual cultures, they have general themes that we would call archetypes. And so like every culture has a nurturing mother figure, and every culture has a hero, and every culture has a villain, and and so on and so forth. And that collective unconscious about what makes up kind of that unconscious part is based on those archetypes, those general ideas that have been passed down from culture to culture. Alfred Adler focused more on childhood experiences, and he said that everybody was trying to, what they do to try to get past their inferiority complexes, their unconscious inferiority complexes created in childhood will then define then who they are. So how a person then tries to overcome that inferiority suggests what kind of individual they are. Questions here? Self-actualization and self-transcendence comes from Maslow, and this is humanistic theory of personality, which says that who you are is based on how you try to achieve your ultimate potential, self-actualization, but also how you try to understand your ultimate purpose, which is self-transcendence. Carl Rogers' concept of self says that when our ideal self and our actual self align. So like when we experience when our sense of who we are is aligned with who we think we should be, we're fully functioning. But we can only get there if we have an environment built for growth that has things like empathy and unconditional positive regard. I know I'm going fast, you guys. So please stop me if you need me to cover something. Trait theory of personality uses assessment tools like exams to measure how much a certain person has in specific characteristics, in specific traits. So they'll often use personality inventories, which are like 5 to 10 questions about similar topics. It might be spread out throughout the assessment. Um, and there might be, let's say, 30 questions, and there's only 5 of each type. Well, then it can give you, using factor analysis, which is kind of combining those results to get a specific number or a specific answer. It can tell someone where they are within that specific trait. And so obviously examples are things like Big Five and MMPI. Reciprocal determinism is when we have 3 distinct things that make up our sense of who we are. One is our environment. So environment affects who we are. One is our behaviors. And one is our personal and cognitive factors, which are things like our temperament and our thoughts and things like that. And what Bandura said about reciprocal determinism is that all 3 of those things affect one another. So our thoughts and our environment affect our behaviors and our thoughts or temperament affect our environment, and our environment and our environment and behavior will affect our thoughts. All right, we're just going to hit a couple of theories, a couple more, and then we're going to go ahead and be done. I actually only have 5 more to do, so I can cover them really fast if you'd like me to. Thurstone's theory of intelligence said that there were 7 primary mental abilities. He gave each of his participants 8 different assessments for each mental ability, which was excessive. But then they got a score and a rating for each of those mental abilities. That's Thurstone. Spearman, who was around at the same time, said 7 different mental abilities, that seems like a lot. How about we just use one, which he called it his G factor, which is a sign of just general intelligence. But he also suggested that there was an S factor, which referred to specific intelligence. Howard Gardner had a theory of intelligence he created in the 1980s, which said that there were 8 distinct types of intelligence. You guys can look them up. There's a long list, but they're all very straightforward, basically showing that everybody's got intelligence, kind of like the participation award theory of intelligence, where everybody gets intelligence, but just of different types. From things like body kinesthetic, where we use our bodies to gain understanding, to naturalistic intelligence, which is our connection with living things, to logical intelligence, which is using things like math and logical arguments to understand stuff. Sternberg's theory of intelligence said that there were 3 distinct types of skills. There were analytical skills, which are things like our logic and stuff like that. There were our creative skills, which are obviously creativity, our ability to create new ideas. And then, oh wow, the name just slipped my mind. Practical skills. Thank you. Practical skills that are basically our street smarts, our common sense. And then finally, we're going to finish this off with the difference between crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is the intelligence that we have based on the accumulation of knowledge. As we age, our crystallized intelligence grows more and more and more. And often, problem solving connected to things we already know uses our crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is when we are able to problem solve with things that we have little to no experience with. When we're able to just work it and figure it out. Fluid intelligence tends to get better with age until about middle adulthood, and then it starts declining. All right, and that is where we covered everything that got at least 2 votes. Is there anything on here, you guys? Thank you, those of you guys who remained. A lot of good patience. Is there anything on here that I didn't cover, but you're like, I really need to know what that is? No? Well, okay then. We are